What's up, my fellow patricians? Welcome to the first episode of Pondering the Meta, in which we'll unfurl the maps, put on our thinking caps, uncork the Courvoisier, and take an analytical approach to learning and tinkering with the Squad Metagame. Theory crafting, map strategy, and in general a critical review of what works and what doesn't. I'm sure it's going to wind up being a little more long-form and self-indulgent than some of my other videos. It's got to be, really, if I'm going to be at all successful in memeing squad strategies into reality. In my opinion, games like PR and Squad should be thought of as somewhat of a sandbox in which players should be encouraged to try wild stuff. It's inevitable that over the course of thousands of games, a meta will form that is downstream of balance and mechanics. This is just what happens with video games. At any given moment, you have 3,000 people playing Squad, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Someone's gonna crack the meta. I tend to think of it as a brute force approach to finding the path of least resistance to victory. Yet, in a game as open-ended and complex as Squad, there will always be a curveball that can be thrown that might break the game wide open. There will always be the destabilizing element of, is this thing that basically no one thought of actually game-breaking? And those are the things that I want to find, exploit, and then share here. On top of that, there seems to be a genuine ethos of teamwork growing within the player base, and you can be damn sure that I intend to nurture it like the beautiful and delicate flower that it is. I'm loving the direction the game is going in, and ultimately, I'd like Squad to become somewhat of a thinking man's first-person shooter. One where knowledge of real-world tactics permeate the player base, where team play is the default across squads and servers, and where the satisfaction of being the reason your team wins a close round vastly outweighs the impulse to chase a high KDR. With all that said, I am still learning this game. Having turned my nose up at Vanilla Squad, it wasn't until 3 months ago that I dove into the playtests. While that might have helped me get an earlier grasp on the gunplay, I'm still largely oblivious to the existing Squad meta and typical game flow. But I think that's true for a lot of players right now, as both the pub and competitive scene are in total flux. There's never been a better time to jump into the fray. The shakeup from the ICO, combined with comp players' self-imposed exile, presents a unique opportunity to dive headfirst into understanding how the game of Squad plays, so that we can figure out how to exploit it for fun and for profit. So, what is a metagame, and why is it important? In gaming context, the meta is the game within a game. It refers to the prior or outside knowledge of said game that a player brings to the table. In terms of Squad, this can be things like bounding Overwatch or knowing where the weak points in the enemy armor is. Using chess as an example, if white opens with pawn to e4, a good opponent would say, ah yes, the king's pawn opening, and would play pawn to e5 in response. Because this is a match between experienced players, 3 moves later, they're both looking at what is called the Scotch opening. If one of the players was ignorant of this established, very in-meta opening and didn't play it correctly, they would be at an immediate statistical disadvantage. This type of thing is true for all competitive and iterative games, regardless of how complex they are. One of the first meta games that we all learn as kids is tic-tac-toe, where if your opponent goes in the corner and you're going second and place your mark in the center, there's literally a 0% chance your opponent can win that game unless you make a mistake. Maybe not everyone played as much tic-tac-toe as I did as a kid. I don't know. People have played millions and millions of games of chess, and they've collectively figured out the more viable paths to play through the first 10 or so moves. But by the time you get to move 15, there's so many permutations in the game that the complexity of it renders the game unscriptable. Then, instead of playing in meta, they must play more instinctively, relying on concepts like take trades when you're ahead and control the center of the board. It so happens that owning the middle of the map in Squad also seems to be an important aspect of that metagame as well. It might be useful to sometimes think of Squad in terms of chess, but at the end of the day, there are far more permutations to a game of Squad, and things can get squirrely fast. It's 50 on 50, real live, sweaty, surge-drinking, mouth-breathing players on a map that can get as big as 4 clicks wide. There's a lot more than just one X factor, and crazy shit can happen all the time. On the other hand, the number of permutations will also tend to collapse around the game's limited number of objectives. While there might be 100 ways to assault a flag, one round only has half a dozen flags, and only a few of them will actually be relevant at any given time. In this way, a beautiful sort of tug-of-war plays out between executing a well-laid plan versus thriving on the chaos of battle like the murder gremlin you are. You and your team can concoct what seems like the perfect plan from command down, only to have the whole thing unravel when the enemy does something unpredictable. And truth be told, that's part of what gives me pleasure and motivates me to think about the game in this way. Thinking outside the box, playing out of meta, and memeing the entire time and still winning. What can I say? I love it. A few things I've learned about the Squad metagame so far. The importance of radio placement and their defense. Losing a radio has a significant ticket cost that I didn't appreciate at first. It's super easy for noobs to drop down terribly placed radios. I originally had placed all the importance on the hab or spawn bunker, and then thought of the radio as defunct after knocking the hab down. But that's not necessarily the case. Proxying and digging down the hab is a good priority for security reasons, but all the ticket value is on the radio. Not only that, but it's where all the build and ammo is stored. Downstream from radio placement is if the fob or hab is even in a relevant spot to begin with. The sweet spot for offensive fobs seems to be somewhere around 200 and 300 meters away from the target. Also, because both the fob and the radio have an exclusionary radius, boneheaded placement can really botch things depending on where the flags spawn. If flags wind up being close together, and you put a fob in a kind of middle ground area, you basically rob your team of the ability to get a second fob that's relevant to both of those flags. Another thing is, the game plays fast, in several ways. Not only can you get wiped within 10 seconds for taking a poor path, but you'll feel crunched for time the whole way. And it's not even a run speed thing. It's the fact that jostling flags can require you to want to be on the other side of the map instantly, if you could. Objectives can shift quickly. If you're attacking, but the flag behind you just went neutral, that basically means you only have a few minutes to either successfully neutral the flag you're assaulting, or abort and double back. And if that's a decision you made instantly, well, then you still have to inform and organize your squad, call in for heli or ground transportation or otherwise, and then follow through on it. And 3 minutes ain't much time. I've seen it where a dedicated squad effectively won a game by putting on their Army Corps of Engineer hats and basically encircled the map and all relevant locations of it with fobs in savvy and useful areas. and it basically enabled the entire team to hop around the map much faster than the enemy could when objectives shifted. It made it so that when we took one flag, we could then quickly switch over into keeping pressure up on subsequent flags before the enemy could even establish bodies there to stop us. I think it's useful to think of game flow in terms of where to apply pressure to objectives. Colonel, what are some of the core aspects that I can get started with while you're down in the lab cooking up those spicy tactical meals? For starters, practice squad leading. I think it's safe to say that squad leading is the most impactful role in the game, and is also the most difficult. A competent SL with a good grasp of the meta will win more games and have more fun, plain and simple. When a team happens to have a solid concentration of good SLs, well, that's when you start to roll enemies right off the map. Even if you don't intend to play a lot of squad leader, try it out for a few rounds so as to be more aware of how difficult the role actually is. It's a weird skill to describe, but being aware of what playing SL is actually like will help inform you about how to play with your future SLs and not inadvertently play against them. It's a role that is made much easier by having squad mates that click and communicate well and keep themselves in a position to react rapidly to whatever calls get made. Trust me, you play 3 straight rounds of squad leader, you will forever be sympathetic to the cacophony of schizophrenic voices between all the communication channels that the SL is always listening to. It helps you know to keep communications to a minimum or to local comms if you can. Another thing is practice offensive suppression and achieving and maintaining fire superiority. The new suppression mechanics introduced a potent offensive tool that has massive implications for affecting enemy player behavior. Stress test it. When you're advancing and the cover has been blown, make it a point to have your squad be the loudest motherfuckers on the block. Give the enemy a migraine, and then run up and snatch their flag. Throwing lead in the general direction of a target can flush them from an area, and if you do it well and your squad moves forward while suppressing, you minimize the negative of it, which is that you're giving your position away. It's also important to be flexible. You first have to be a generalist before you can be a specialist. In regards to breaking open a metagame, if you have a wide base of an understanding of a game, you'll have an easier time spotting where a potential weakness is. If you only have a specific skill set, in a sense what you're doing is intentionally handicapping yourself by restricting your playstyle. It's obviously ideal if every squad is a Swiss Army knife, but let's not kid ourselves here. In pubs, things are disorganized by default. Playstyles that are reactive are going to be better equipped to handle the decentralized chaos and consequently will excel on a game-to-game basis. Practice being on the assault. Due to the changes of how mobility impacts weapon handling, being on offensive is much more challenging now. I think we're all still trying to figure out exactly how much harder it's gotten, but if the enemy is entrenched, it might be as rough as needing 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1 advantage body-wise to forcibly wrest a flag from an enemy. Spend some time hurling yourself into the void. And the last point here that I think is going to be pretty core to the meta is get reps running in a mechanized infantry squad. If you enjoy running armor, mechanized infantry is going to be a downright sledgehammer. Get some reps running a LAV or striker embedded within an infantry squad so that squad comms are shared. The infantry can keep lat and hat kits off of your back so that you can murk everything else at range. I 100% think that mechanized infantry is going to be a staple of the post-ICO metagame. And that does it for this one. I've got a few ideas I'm playing with for future episodes that I don't think will be too far off. Feel free to share any thoughts you have. I've been pretty stoked on the quality of comments I've been seeing so far, and I'm hoping that this format might help us all to sort of crowdsource some game-breaking ideas so that we can all stomp some noobs together.